I think we're going to have a very nice day today. And welcome to Jack Spruill's workshop titled Propagation of Figs by Air Layering. The plan for today goes a little bit like this. I'm going to give you some instructions on how to do air layering, but it comes in two parts. The first part does the air layering, and you walk away with the air layering. It'll look like this. It'll look like that on the bush. It'll still be attached to the fig. And once you reach that point, then you've got to give the fig time to develop roots. And that's going to take at least a month, maybe 2 months. So that's the point at which we're going to have a break. The first question is, what is air layering? Well, air layering is a propagation technique which gives you a new plant that has exactly the same characteristics as the parent plant. It basically is a clone. And when would you use a technique like that? Air layering is appropriate if you need a small number of new plants. If you need 3 or 4, maybe 10. If you need 400 new plants, air layering is too difficult, takes too much time. You would do something like stem rootings, which I'm sure many of you have done that. So if you need a lot of them, air layering is not your technique. But if you want just a small number, try air layering. It works very well. So to begin with, I would like to talk about the anatomy of a tree. Okay, so everybody knows about trees. They know they consist of roots, a great big trunk, big limbs, little limbs, twigs, leaves, buds, the whole works. Everybody knows all about that. But what many people don't know is how these various components of the tree work together to keep the tree alive and make it grow. And so that's what I would like to talk about today, because that information is very relevant to air layering. So if you look at the little diagram on page 4, you will see a cross-section of a big tree. And starting at the center of the tree, you see an area that's marked primary xylem. To non-scientists, we call that heartwood. And as you go further toward the outside of the tree, there's another area that we call the secondary xylem. And non-scientists call that sapwood. So the center of the tree is, pardon me, the center of the tree is heartwood. The next layer of wood out is sapwood. Now on a big tree there will be quite a bit of heartwood. On the branches, the large branches may have some heartwood, but by the time you get out to the small branches, there won't be any heartwood at all. It will be all sapwood. Now let's continue out from the sapwood. The next layer out from the sapwood is the cambium layer. It's a very thin layer. It's usually bright green, and it's kind of just under the bark. That is the layer where the tree grows. All the growth of the tree that increases its size occurs in that cambium layer. On the inside of the cambium layer, the xylem, the sapwood, is produced. On the outside of the cambium layer, another layer called the phloem is produced. And that's a relatively thin layer. And as the phloem continues to develop, it turns into bark. So the furthest out part of the trunk is bark. Now, let's talk about the functions of some of these. Everybody knows or probably suspects that the tree gets its moisture from the ground through the roots. And that water is taken up through the sapwood. That's how the water gets up the tree, going up through the sapwood to the leaves. And up in the leaves, we have a very magical thing that happens called photosynthesis. The leaves take in carbon dioxide and they absorb light energy, and they combine the carbon dioxide with water from the roots, and they form sugars. So the leaves form sugars. Now, the sugars that are formed as food for the tree has to be brought back down to the tree to be used. And so the sugars go down the phloem. So water comes up the sapwood, sugars go down the phloem to the branches and the trunk and the roots so they can grow. So that's a good, quick lesson in the physiology of trees. What's the best time of year to do it? Well, the best time to do it is fairly early in the year, in the spring, when the fig is growing and developing very well. And the reason for that is it takes time to grow roots. It takes time for the plant to get acclimated to living on its own. And it takes time for it to get used to being in the soil in its permanent location. So if you have a choice, start your air layering in the spring. And the next question is, well, what should you air layer? And this is perhaps a dumb statement, but select a plant to air layer that has properties that you like. In the case of the figs, select a fig that tastes good, that looks good, that may be cold hardy enough to live where you live. So think about why you're air layering the plant you are, and air layer one that will give you the properties that you want. So I think we're ready now to go ahead and start doing some air layering. Jack, when we were here doing some other air layering, if I only remember one thing from today, it's this: be sure you have enough string. Okay, so first thing you need to do is to select a branch that you think will make a good air layering plant. Now I have selected this one because this is the plant Jack hoped we could air layer. And secondly, it's out here in a nice position. I'm taking that branch off because it's in the way. Okay, so I don't know if you can see the branch or not, but this is it right here, right there. We're going to remove the bark from a region, maybe 3 inches or so, 3 or 4 inches wide to put the air layering on. And you want to leave as much stem above that as you reasonably can so that the plant looks nice. So I'm just going to go ahead here and start the air layering technique. All we do is cut around the stem and remove the bark all the way down to the sapwood. If anybody wants to walk over here and look, please do. I think you can see a whole lot more if you walk over here.
So what's the distance between the two cuts?
Well, in this case, I'm guessing it might be 3 inches. I guess I'll make it a little more. It doesn't matter. I like to make it a distance so that the roots have about that much room to develop. And so I put some dimensions in the write-up, but they're not critical at all. And so what we're doing is simply removing everything down to the sapwood. This is why rooting stem cuttings is faster.
Is there any risk that you scrape too far down there?
No, because the branch is quite thick and you're going to have sapwood all the way to the middle. So you're not going to go too deep. Oh, one thing I did not mention that I would like to mention now, and that is when you select a branch to air layer, I would recommend doing it on one that's either horizontal or vertical or somewhere in between. If you try to do it on a branch that hangs down, for some reason, the roots don't like the idea of going up to the sphagnum moss. They usually will do it, but they don't like to. And so sooner or later you'll air layer some that hang down. But in general, I would say don't do it if you have a better choice.
The name got away from me, so they're unknown. But all the rest of them have two names.
Okay, I've pretty well got that cleaned off. I'm going to kind of hold it up this way so maybe you can see it. And the distance here doesn't make a whole lot of difference. That's where your roots are going to develop. And the roots will develop at the top. Once in a while you'll get some at the bottom that try, but they're never going to amount to anything. Your roots will come from up at the top of the cleared area. Okay, so the next thing we gotta have, anyway, I usually just take a bread wrapper like that, and I usually cut out a section that's about 8 inches wide, because that's about the size you need to fold it around like this, around like that, to form a cylinder around the limb. So, we're ready to continue. Now this is the part where you need 3 or 4 hands, but we don't have that luxury. So I'll show you how I try to do it. What we're trying to do is form a little cylinder around this area where we've cut it. And here's how we're going to do it. We're going to wrap that around like that. Overlap it a little bit. Like that. And I like to stick a piece of tape on there to try to hold it in place. Otherwise, it gets very difficult to handle. And let's see if we can get one at the top. And just for good measure, we'll put a little piece in the middle. That's just to try to keep that plastic under control.
Oh, no, you're fine. There are commercial holders that you could buy and not use the plastic. But on Haddock's they blow.
Okay.
It blows and that ruins your.
Now I've got the joint where I've put the two pieces of plastic reasonably together. Now I want to run some tape the full length of the thing so it'll seal nicely. What kind of tape do you use? Anything you've got that's waterproof. This is just plain old duct tape. Okay, I don't know if you can see it or not, but what I've done, I've made a cylinder that simply goes around the limb like that I can fill with soft sphagnum moss. Okay, the next thing we do, we want to put the sphagnum moss in here, but we don't want it to just fall out, so we'll put a string around there and tie it fairly tight, because in addition to keeping the sphagnum moss inside the cylinder, you also want to keep the moisture in there, because the moisture that you put in with the sphagnum moss is pretty much all the moisture the new roots are going to have. So you don't want to lose that moisture. And I've tied this about an inch or so below the bottom cut. All right, now I can tell already that I've got a lot more cylinder than I need, so I'm going to cut some of it off to make it a little easier. I don't need it as long as I have it. Okay, next comes putting the sphagnum moss in. Okay, we got sphagnum moss here. And you can feel the moss, and you can try to decide how wet you think it should be. You want it fairly damp. As I said, this is the only moisture that those forming roots are going to have.
Now, I've used propagation mix in the past. Does that matter, or is this better?
I don't think it matters.
No.
This is what I've always used. I think almost anything would work. Okay, so it's moist. I'd like it a little bit wetter. All right, now if you put too much water in, you can probably wring some of the water out like that. And if you squeeze out the excess water, you'll be just fine. So, put this sphagnum moss in the cylinder. Well, I know one thing. I should have made the cylinder slightly bigger because my spoon doesn't fit. Anyway, maybe I can put it. So you put it in there and you work it toward the bottom, because what you're trying to do is simply fill that cylinder up with sphagnum moss.
Bob, I can see a risk in not having the cylinder big enough, but you think there's any risk in having it too big?
Well, I don't think you're likely to make it unreasonably big. I don't think there's any risk,
Okay.
no. After you've done a few of these, you'll figure out that you'll just almost automatically make it a convenient size. I can tell you one thing, don't make your cylinder too small. All right, so I'm trying to work this down. I've got a little stick that helps push it down. And another thing to keep in mind, you want to keep the branch in the middle of the cylinder. But you can move the branch around in there after you've got the sphagnum moss in. So that's a consideration for later. You keep filling the plastic cylinder until the sphagnum moss is above the cut where you've removed the bark. Something that's not in the little handout, and that is this. You probably have seen grapevines or figs or something where there was a branch very close to the ground, and when you look at it closely you find out it's rooted. And so people sometimes use that as a propagation technique. They bend the limb down to the ground and step on it, maybe put a little dirt on it, put a rock on it, and when they come back, they have new roots and a new plant. That is called layering. This is called air layering because we're doing the same thing, but we have it up in the air. So that's why this is called air layering.
Well, Bob, on that subject, say like we were going to lean that limb down there, and you think you ought to skin that?
Skin what?
Like you're going to lean that limb down and
Oh, you
dirt-
mean to just layer it?
Yeah,
Yeah, you would have to push it down all the way to the ground.
but you think you ought to skin it just like you're doing for air layering?
No, normally they wouldn't. I imagine you could, but
I see.
I have never done it that way, but I've seen lots of instances where new roots did develop just because the branch or the vine was in contact with the soil. I think I've got enough there. All right, so we're going to kind of move this sphagnum moss around, make sure that the branch is pretty much in the middle of it. Now we're back to tying. We're going to tie a string around the top of it.
Whoops.
And again, when you tie it, try to keep the sphagnum moss pretty well confined in there. Don't leave a whole lot of air space. When I get this done, I'm going to let you come over and take a close look. Again, you want to tie it fairly tight.
It's not very nature friendly, but couldn't you use those plastic tie things?
Oh yeah, sure, if you can tie them tight enough. Okay, now this is the part that doesn't have to be done, but I like to do it. What I'm doing is just trimming off some of the excess everything. Trim off the excess string. Now I've got excess plastic bag at both ends. I'm going to cut off some of that because you just don't need it. It's doing nothing. It's just there. This is kind of tidying up the work. And I'll do both ends so it looks fairly nice. Okay, now we got that on there. Basically, the job is done, except for two things.
Yep.
Oh, before I put the aluminum foil on there, I want you to come and take a look at it and see what it looks like. And the reason for using a bag that you can see through is that you will see the roots when they form. So all we've done is taken the sphagnum moss, put it around that cut area, and held it in place with the plastic. Okay, and the last step here is to wrap it with some aluminum foil. And the reason for the aluminum foil is this. The sun gets very intense. And the sphagnum moss is dark and it absorbs the heat energy from the sun. It can get hot. And if you've got very delicate roots, you don't want to heat those roots. So this will reflect the UV, or not the UV, the IR sun rays, and keep the sphagnum moss from getting too hot. It also has the advantage that when you want to come back and see if you have roots developing properly, you can take the aluminum foil off and look, put the aluminum foil back on. So, that is all done except for one very important thing. And that is we need to label it. If you're the only one doing it and you know what it is, all right, well, it's up to you if you want to label or not. But in general, I would say you need a label. You need to identify on the label what the name of the fig plant is that you're reproducing and when you air layered it. And if other people are air layering it, it'd be a good idea to put your name on it. So that's how you start. That's how you do the air layering to that point. Now, the plant's going to take time to develop roots. A month, 2 months. 2 months is probably more realistic. But we can't wait 2 months. So we're going to take a 10-minute break. And when we come back, we'll pop that one over there because that one has roots. Okay, so here we go. What we're going to do, we have air layered this thing and we now have roots. So now we're going to put it in a pot.
Tell them you cut it off last
Yeah.
night.
I cut this off last night from the parent plant. And this was a case where it was hanging down slightly. Anyway, it has developed roots. We're ready to put it in a pot. And the purpose of doing that is to give these roots a chance to harden and develop more. And also to give the plant time to get used to living on its own and not depending upon the parent plant. So, first thing we got to do is get the plastic cylinder open and get to the roots. So you have to cut the nice strings that we put on.
Yeah, I'll put it in the trash.
Oh, before I cut the top ones, I want to point out that some of the roots were coming out above the air layer. If you try to air layer a branch that's hanging down, the roots really don't want to go up, and they probably will do exactly that. But we don't need those roots. We really don't want them, so I'm going to cut them off. The roots we want are these. So I'm going to try to cut those off. Okay, now we got to. So when you cut it open, try not to hurt your roots.
It's underway, and so hopefully we can hear it, okay?
We have nice roots on this. I'm very pleased. I was afraid we might not have very many.
When did you start that one?
This one was air layered on the 30th of July. This is very interesting. I'm going to take it around and show you because I have never seen this happen before, but it's interesting. Here are the roots that we want, and here's a root that has formed from below the cut. The cut is under there. So it's trying to grow. It's doing everything it. Yeah, you got another one there. Roots are pretty delicate. It would be nice to be able to bend them around and do the nice things. But I'm not going to do that because I'm afraid I would break them. So we're just going to put it in there like that. And I've moistened this is just potting soil. I've moistened the potting soil, so it should be about right. And just go like that. By all means, come up and take a look. So, we now have I got to put these back. We now have a nice plant which actually has a fig on it. But you saw the roots, and the question is, can those few roots supply moisture to all of these leaves? The answer probably is no. So we have to do something to decrease the need for water. You have to cut the plant back to the point where those roots can support it. And so you have to make a decision somewhere and start cutting. So let's take that off. And the next decision is harder. We have a pretty nice shoot here. And we have two pretty nice ones there. Where do we cut? I don't know the answer. I'm inclined to cut the big one. In the long run, it won't make much difference because it'll develop more shoots at the bottom and more shoots up here, and pretty soon it'll look like that. What I think I'm going to do, I think I'm going to remove the two side shoots and let this main shoot go. So here we go. We've got to decrease the demand for water. Now, we don't have very many leaves left up here, but what we do have still requires quite a lot of water. So what I like to do is cut the leaves back. Now you may say, well, you're being awfully hard on that plant. But if you don't do something like that, those roots simply can't provide the water. So the last thing let's take the fig out. We don't want to spend our energy growing figs. The last thing you need to do is put a label on it. And I have labeled this variety as Cahoon, the same as that one. It will give you red colored figs. It was air layered on the 30th of July. And I planned ahead and I said we potted it on the 10th of September. So I now have a label that's appropriate for it. So there it is. You need to leave it in here and let those roots harden and grow and let it get used to being on its own. And then when you think it's ready, you can put it out in its permanent location. And when you do put it out in its permanent location, plan ahead. Think about what it's going to look like when it's the size of those bushes. Give it room so it has room to grow. And don't put it on top of your septic tank drain field or somewhere like that. And figs don't like to be in areas where it's wet, so don't plant it in an area that tends to be real wet. Put it out in the sun where it gets sun, and it should do very well.
Will you wait till warm weather to put that in the ground?
This one I think I would. That one I'd plant it out this afternoon. It's ready to go. This one I probably would keep it over the winter. And I think what I would do is wait and, well, kind of baby it. Put it out in the sun for an hour or two a day, or maybe a little more, and then give it some shade. And do that for a while. Sooner or later, the weather's going to turn cold, and it's going to get to the point where you'll be below freezing at night. I think for overwintering, I just dig a hole and plant the whole pot. That way the tree experiences the same weather that every other plant does. And in the spring, I think you'll be ready to go.
Would you put that in a protected area instead of like out in the open?
Yeah, I think I'd protect it. And protect it from deer and rabbits, things like that. But anyway, that's where we stand on that.